Hi guys, welcome to class. So today I'm going to be reading you guys The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. You should have gotten this in your email, so please feel free to read along with me. A reminder before we start that this is one of the 4 options that you have for your final paper. So you're going to be choosing between this one, between Harrison Bergeron, Futurama, and South Park, and you're going to discuss the themes and the arguments being made and how they're being made within the text. That's going to be your paper. So this is one of those 4. When I am done reading it, I will give you what I can of my initial analysis of the piece so that you have something to talk about, something to jump off of, something to make conclusions in your own arguments with as you write your paper. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Now if you choose this one, you should really read the italicized bits on the first 2 pages. Let me see. It goes all the way down here to here. The story actually begins here, so this is where we're going to start, is on page 347, okay? With a clamor of bells that set the swallows soaring, the festival of summer came to the city of Omelas, bright towered by the sea. The rigging of the boats in the harbor sparkled with flags. In the streets between houses with red roofs and painted walls, between old moss-grown gardens and under avenues of trees, past great parks and public buildings, processions moved. Some were decorous, old people in long stiff robes of mauve and gray, grave-master workmen, quiet, merry women carrying their babies and chatting as they walked. In other streets the music beat faster, a shimmering of gong and tambourine, and the people went dancing. The procession was a dance. Children dodged in and out, their high calls rising like the swallows crossing flights over the music and the singing. All the processions wound toward the north side of the city, where on the great water meadow, called the Green Fields, boys and girls, naked in the bright air, with mud-stained feet and ankles, and long, lithe arms, exercised their restive horses before the race. The horses wore no gear at all, but a halter without bit. Their manes were braided with streamers of silver, gold, and green. They flared their nostrils and pranced and boasted to one another. They were vastly excited, the horse being the only animal who has adopted our ceremonies as his own. Far off to the north and west, the mountain stood up half encircling Omelas on her bay. The air of the morning was so clear that the snow still crowning the 18 peaks burned with a white gold fire across the miles of sunlit air under the dark blue of the sky. There was just enough wind to make the banners that marked the race course snap and flutter now and then. In the silence of the broad green meadows, one could hear the music winding through the city streets, farther and nearer, and ever approaching. A cheerful, faint sweetness of the air that from time to time trembled and gathered together, and broke out into the great joyous clanging of the bells. Joyous! How was one to tell about joy? How describe the citizens of Omelas? They were not simple folk, you see, though they were happy. But we do not say the words of cheer much any more. All smiles have become archaic. Given descriptions such as this, one tends to make certain assumptions. Given a description such as this, one tends to look next for the king, mounted on a splendid stallion and surrounded by his noble knights, perhaps in a golden litter borne by great-muscled slave. But there was no king. They did not use swords or keep slaves. They were not barbarians. I do not know the rules and laws of the society, but I suspect that they were singularly few. As they did without monarchy and slavery, so they also got on without the stock exchange, the advertisement, the secret police, and the bomb. Yet I repeat that these were not simple folk, not dulcet shepherds, noble slaves, bland utopians. They were not less complex than us. The trouble is that we have a bad habit, encouraged by pedants and sophisticates, of considering happiness as something rather stupid. Only pain is intellectual, only evil interesting. This is the treason of the artist, a refusal to admit the banality of evil and the terrible boredom of pain. If you can't lick 'em, join 'em. If it hurts, repeat it. But to praise despair is to condemn delight. To embrace violence is to lose hold of everything else. We have almost lost hold. We can no longer describe a happy man, nor make any celebration of joy. How can I tell you about the people of Omelas? They are not naive and happy children, though their children were, in fact, happy. They were mature, intelligent, passionate adults, whose lives were not wretched. Oh, miracle, but I wish I could describe it better. I wish I could convince you. Omelas sounds in my words like a city in a fairy tale, long ago and far away, once upon a time. Perhaps it would be best if you imagine it as your own fancy bids, assuming it will rise to the occasion, for certainly I cannot suit you all. For instance, how about technology? I think that there would be no cars or helicopters in and above the streets. This follows from the fact that the people of Omelas are happy people. Happiness is based on a just discrimination of what is necessary, what is neither necessary nor destructive, and what is destructive. In the middle category, however, that of the unnecessary but undestructive, that of comfort, luxury, exuberance, etc., they could perfectly well have central heating, subway trains, washing machines, and all kinds of marvelous devices not yet invented here. Floating light sources, fuelless power, a cure for the common cold. Or they could have none of that. It doesn't matter. As you like it. I incline to think that people from towns up and down the coast have been coming to Omelas during the last days of the festival on very fast little trains and double-deck trams, and that the train station of Omelas is actually the handsomest building in the town, though plainer than the magnificent farmer's market. But even granted trains, I fear that Omelas so far strikes some of you as goody-goody. Smiles, bells, parades, horses, blech. If so, please add an orgy. If an orgy would help, don't hesitate. Let us not, however, have temples from which issue beautiful nude priests and priestesses, already half in ecstasy and ready to copulate, with any man or woman, lover or stranger, who desires union with the deep godhead of the blood, although that was my first idea. But really, it would be better not to have temples in Omelas. At least not man-temples. Religion yes, clergy no. Surely the beautiful nudes can just wander about, offering themselves like divine soufflés of the hunger of the needy and the rapture of the flesh. Let them join in the processions. Let tambourines be struck above the copulation, and the glory of desire be proclaimed upon the gongs, and, a not unimportant point, let the offspring of these delightful rituals be loved and looked after by all. One thing I know there is none of in Omelas is guilt. But what else should there be? I thought at first there were no drugs, but that is puritanical. For those who like it, the fate-insistent sweetness of drues may perfume the ways of the city. Drues which first brings a great lightness and brilliance to the mind and limbs, and then after some hours of dreamy languor, and wonderful visions at last of the very arcana and innermost secrets of the universe, as well as exciting the pleasure of sex beyond all belief, and is not habit-forming. For more modest tastes, I think there ought to be beer. What else? What else belongs in the joyous city? The sense of victory, surely, the celebration of courage. But as we did without clergy, let us do without soldiers. The joy built upon successful slaughter is not the right kind of joy. It will not do. It is fearful, and it is trivial. A boundless and generous contentment, a magnanimous triumph, felt not against some outer enemy, but in communion with the finest and the fairest in the souls of all men, everywhere, in the splendor of the world's summer. This is what swells the hearts of the people of Omelas, and the victory they celebrate is that of life. I really don't think many of them need to take drues. Most of the processions have reached the green fields by now. A marvelous smell of cooking goes forth from the red and blue tents of the provisioners. The faces of small children are amiably sticky. In the benign grey beard of a man, a couple of crumbs of rich pastry are entangled. The youths and girls have mounted their horses, and are beginning to group around the starting line of the course. An old woman, small, fat, and laughing, is passing out flowers from a basket, and the tall young men wear her flowers in their shining hair. A child of 9 or 10 sits at the edge of the crowd, alone, playing on a wooden flute. People pause to listen, and they smile, but they do not speak to him, for he never ceases playing and never sees them, his dark eyes wholly wrapped in the sweet, thin magic of the tune. He finishes, and slowly lowers his hands holding the wooden flute. As if that little private silence were the signal, all at once a trumpet sounds from the pavilion near the starting line. Imperious, melancholy, piercing. The horses rear on their slender legs, and some of them neigh in answer, sober-faced. The young riders stroke their horses' necks and soothe them, whispering, "Quiet, quiet there, my beauty, my hope." They begin to form a rank along the starting line. The crowds along the race course are like a field of grass and flowers in the wind. The festival of summer has begun. Do you believe? Do you accept the festival, the city, the joy? No? Then let me describe one more thing. In the basement, under one of the beautiful public buildings of Omelas, perhaps in the cellar of one of its spacious private homes, there is a room. It has one locked door and no window. A little light seeps in dustily between cracks in the boards, second-hand from a cobwebbed window somewhere across the cellar. In one corner of the little room, a couple of mops, with stiff, clotted, foul-smelling heads, stand near a rusty bucket. The floor is dirt, a little damp to the touch, as cellar dirt usually is. The room is about 3 paces long and 2 wide, a mere broom closet or disused tool room. In the room a child is sitting. It could be a boy or a girl. It looks about 6, but is actually nearly 10. It is feeble-minded. Perhaps it was born defective, or perhaps it has become imbecile through fear, malnutrition, and neglect. It picks its nose and occasionally fumbles vaguely with its toes or genitals, as it sits hunched in the corner farthest from the bucket and the two mops. It is afraid of the mops. It finds them horrible. It shuts its eyes, and it knows the mop's still standing there, and the door is locked, and nobody will come. The door is always locked and nobody ever comes, except that sometimes the child has no understanding of time or interval. Sometimes the door rattles terribly and opens, and a person or several people are there. One of them may come in and kick the child to make it stand up. The others never come close, but peer in at it with frightened, disgusted eyes. The food bowl and the water jug are hastily filled. The door is locked. The eyes disappear. The people at the door never say anything, but the child, who has not always lived in the tour room, can remember sunlight and its mother's voice, sometimes speaks. "I will be good," it says. "Please let me out. I will be good." They never answer. The child used to scream for help at night and cry a good deal, but now it only makes a kind of whining ee-yaw, ee-yaw, and it speaks less and less often. It is so thin there are no calves to its legs. Its belly protrudes. It lives on a half bowl of cornmeal and grease a day. It is naked. Its buttocks and thighs are a mass of festered sores, as it sits in its own excrement continually. They all know it is there, all the people of Omelas. Some of them have come to see it, others are content merely to know it is there. They all know that it has to be there. Some of them understand why, and some do not, but they all understand that their happiness, the beauty of their city, the tenderness of their friendships, the health of their children, the wisdom of their scholars, the skills of their makers, even the abundance of their harvest, and the kindly weathers of their skies depend wholly on this child's abominable misery. This is usually explained to children when they are between 8 and 12, whenever they seem capable of understanding. And most of those who come to see the child are young people, though often enough an adult comes, or comes back to see the child. No matter how well the matter has been explained to them, these young spectators are always shocked and sickened at the sight. They feel disgust, which they had thought themselves superior to. They feel anger, outrage, impotence, despite all the explanations. They would like to do something for the child, but there is nothing they can do. If the child were brought up into the sunlight out of that vile place, if it were cleaned and fed and comforted, that would be a good thing indeed. But if it were done, in that day and hour, all the prosperity and beauty and delight of Omelas would wither and be destroyed. Those are the terms. To exchange all the goodness and grace for every life in Omelas for that single, small improvement, to throw away the happiness of thousands for the chance of the happiness of one, that would be to let guilt within the walls indeed. The terms are strict and absolute. There may not even be a kind word spoken to the child. Often, young people go home in tears, or in a tearless rage, when they have seen the child and faced his terrible paradox. They may brood over it for weeks or years, but as time goes on, they begin to realize that even if the child could be released, it would not get much good of its freedom. A little vague pleasure of warmth and food, no doubt, but little more. It is too degraded and imbecile to know any real joy. It has been afraid too long, ever to be free of fear. Its habits are too uncouth for it to respond to humane treatment. Indeed, after so long, it would probably be wretched without walls about it to protect it, and darkness for its eyes, and its own excrement to sit in. The tears at the bitter injustice dry when they begin to perceive the terrible justice of reality, and to accept it. Yet is their tears and anger, the trying of their generosity and the acceptance of their helplessness, which are perhaps the true source of the splendor of their lives. Theirs is no vapid, irresponsible happiness. They know that they, like the child, are not free. They know compassion. It is the existence of the child and their knowledge of its existence that makes possible the nobility of their architecture, the poignancy of their music, the profundity of their science. It is because of the child that they are so gentle with children. They know that if the wretched one were not there sniveling in the dark, the other one, the flute player, could make no joyful music as the young riders line up in their beauty for the race in the sunlight on the first morning of summer. Now do you believe in them? Are they not more credible? But there is one more thing to tell, and this is quite incredible. At times, one of the adolescent girls or boys who go to see the child does not go home and weep or rage, does not, in fact, go home at all. Sometimes, also, a man or woman much older falls silent for a day or two, and then leaves. These people go out into the street and walk down the street alone. They keep walking, and walk straight out of the city of Omelas, through the beautiful gates. They keep walking across the farmlands of Omelas. Each one goes alone, youth or girl, man or woman. Night falls. The traveler must pass down village streets between the houses with yellow-lit windows, and on out into the darkness of the fields. Each alone, They go west or north towards the mountains. They go on. They leave Omelas. They walk ahead into the darkness and they do not come back. The place they go towards is a place even less imaginable to most of us than the city of happiness. I cannot describe it at all. It is possible that it does not exist. But they seem to know where they are going. The ones who walk away from Omelas. It's pretty messed up, right? If not obvious by now, dark adult themes present here. However, let's make some very serious connections with this. I'm going to do something called cubing, and this is one strategy of breaking down a text in different ways. So first thing we're going to do is called describing this. Step 1, describe. It's modern. It's first world literature. It takes place in the first world, and it's a utopia turned dystopia. Why we talked about dystopian stuff, right? It's also satire, of course, because it wants to make us feel shame. This might actually connect just a little bit more presently with what's going on and how people behave with the haves versus the have-nots, because that is part of one of the real metaphors that is happening here. Okay, we described it. That's what it is. So second step is to compare and contrast. Very easy oppositions going on here. We have the first world versus the third world. Very obvious connections of the people of Omelas versus the child. The people of Omelas are us. The child are people in the third world, even more distinctly child slaves. We will get there. There's also the comparison of Marxism or human rights versus utilitarianism or the greater good. We also have the children of Omelas specifically against the child. We see the flute player versus the child in the cellar in the basement being directly compared against each other. We have, of course, Omelas, this utopia versus reality, and how much utopias cannot exist because it's just not possible. We also have this dichotomy comparison of pleasure and pain, technology versus nature, maturity versus ignorance or innocence. Comparisons. This is the beginning of us starting to pull things that we might create connections to the real world with, or themes. You can probably see some of the themes and connections already because I can't keep my mouth shut. I love to rant about the stuff. That's why we're talking about it and writing about it. All right, associate. So this is where we're going to start making connections from the text to real knowledge that we have, or why we're making a satire to begin with. Why are we talking about these things? How can we create connections to real life? Let's make associations. How many of you guys know that in the last 30 years, global inequality between developed and developing countries has increased rapidly? You might know what rapidly, but increased in rapid rate. Now, what does this mean? This means that we have a wider gap between money, resources, justice, and we typically have more exploitation of those who are without, the haves and the have-nots again. Very clear association happening in this story. Global inequality, very present in a lot of our news, although maybe not quite as recently, but in general, that's something that we're deeply concerned with in the world, is how much smaller of a world we become, how much more it's clear that people who have money versus those who do not, who have power versus those who are not, live very different lives. Part of what this creates is linked with consumerism, which is why we do an ad analysis, which is very important for a world we're so consumed with advertisements and whatnot. So consumerism, our need to buy things to survive or otherwise, is at the cost of slave labor. Now, up on the screen, I'm going to put a list because I can't write on the board. So you guys can see some of the corporations and companies who use child slave labor in third world countries. Forever 21, Aeropostale, Toys R Us, which I'm glad they've closed down because children making toys for children. I mean, is there not a clear connection warrant that we can find? Warrant and backing here, people. This is the thing. The Toulmin terms. Urban Outfitters, Victoria's Secret, Daewoo, Disney, Walmart, Nestle, FIFA, Shell. By the way, Shell, big genocide of Nigerian indigenous tribes and whatnot. Apple, Nike, Gap, H&M, every single one of them, and so many more. Forced labor, cheap labor over in third world countries where they have hazardous conditions. Apple is a great example of this. Did you know that Apple has its buildings and it has nets around its buildings? Well, this is not for the safety of their workers. This is because so many of them had tried to commit suicide or committed suicide by jumping out of the building that now they just get into the net and they roll right back into work. Congratulations, you don't even have the power to kill yourself anymore. This is the type of thing I was talking about with the inequality, with the vapid, drastic difference between those of us who have, and I'm not even just talking about us, although we are part of the problem. The people who have more than us, the elite people who have billions and millions and whatnot of dollars, and them making it off of the people who are paid cents a day. 50 cents a day? 18-hour days. You barely get to sit, you barely get to move, you barely get to go to the bathroom, you barely get to eat. Most of them are children. This is the child in the closet. Are real children who are picking through garbage, electronic waste, who are being beaten and raped and then having their children taken from them, and all these terrible things that are happening to children and people who cannot help themselves. And the horrible thing is when they're done, when they finally rise up against these corporations, they just pick up and move and leave and start doing it to somebody else and leave these people in absolute poverty and destruction. It is insanely disgusting, guys, which is why we're talking about it. This is why this is an important story to read, to understand the connections and how it connects to the real life. Okay, I'm gonna try not to rant too terribly much. So this is caused by consumerism. We're talking about the people who supply us with stuff that we want because we want it and we're bored and we need something to make us happy because our lives are also a different type of slavery. We can get to that at another time. But there's this cycle of a lack of freedom, which she talks about at the end. Le Guin, by the way, who's the author's name. At the end, she talks about how the people of Omelas aren't free either. And that's where they're talking about us and our lack of ability to not buy from these places because we have no other options. Local manufacturing has pretty much been depleted in America. We're slowly starting to do it again. Current circumstances demonstrating how we need to open up more of our own production. Because of the trend of shifting to overseas production and child slave labor, we don't have many of the facilities we used to have, which also means that we don't have the pollution that we used to have. We'll talk about that in Futurama, or we talked about that in Futurama. Very clear themes that I like to talk about here, guys. Okay, consumerism causes slave labor. Hopefully the connections are clear for you guys. When do we become aware of the world? I'll give you a hint. It's when the children go see the child, between 8 and 12. This is normally the time when we are slowly coming out of our own bubbles, of our own innocence, unless of course we've had a disruptive childhood. Some of us have. Most people with a first world experience of what childhood is like have a very innocent outlook on things. They don't understand anything but their own problems. And then slowly we start to realize that there are more people in the world than we thought, that there are more problems going on, that we are not the center of the universe anymore. And we are beginning to understand that bad things happen to people all the time, and nobody seems to really have any control over this. It's the adage of life is hard, and then you die. The life is hard part, and when we start to realize that life isn't just candy and roses, things aren't just handed to us, we have to work for them. When we start to learn the value of a dollar, when we start to learn that people are starving in other countries, in our own country, that people are homeless, that people are abused, and all these terrible things that we try to shelter children from, there's a time when we realize and we come out of it. It is usually 8 to 12 naturally. We start to become more and more aware of our surroundings, what's happening to other people. This is why she has the children go see that child between 8 and 12, because they are finally in the right mindset to grasp what cruelty is present in the world and how they have to torture that child in order to have vast happiness. And that's part of the problem, is vast happiness. Why do you need to have so much more happiness that you can't give somebody else a little bit of your own? Do they have to be unhappy for that child to be free? We'll talk about this in a little bit, but start thinking about that idea. Okay, so we are aware of the atrocities that happen in the world. Most of us follow the news, we see things, we see stories, we watch movies, we read books, we see the bad things happen to people, so we know some of the major atrocities that have happened in this world. Why do we remain passive about them? Because a lot of us do. And I'll give you a hint. It's our form of slavery. We are wage slaves, most of us, meaning that we live paycheck to paycheck. If we do not go to work, we will no longer be able to survive. Cue current crisis, but that's not the reason we're talking about this initially. It's just something that's been true for a very long time, and I just think it's more evident right now more than ever. We remain passive because how much we have to work. Think about your day. If you're a student and a full-time student, you have at least 12 credits, which means 4 classes, which means 12 hours a week that you have to spend in class physically. Well, not physically, but actually spend that physical time learning something via video person, lecture, group work, etc. normally. Then you have homework, which typically we think of at least for each hour that you have in class, you're going to likely have 3 hours of homework. That is truly the adage, and if it's not true for you, you're lucky. If it's more than that for you, I'm sorry. But that's typically average. So that's almost a full-time job already. If I can actually do the math, that's 36 hours plus the initial 12 that you have. That is more than a 40-hour work week, guys, that we expect from a full-time student. Now, and on top of that, do you also have to work because school is expensive? Well, add on another 20 to 30 hours a week, and you have 70 to 80 hours that you have to strictly be working, essentially. Then you also have to worry about shopping, about making your food, about having any type of relationship or social life, any other responsibilities that you might have. Say you have children, sports. Add these things up. We are busy. We can only think about what we can get done so that we can either make it a little bit ahead or squeak out even. Sometimes we fall behind, and that consumes us. We are worried about our survival, and that is how they keep us. I say they loosely as a ranting conspiracy theorist, but that is how society and those who have versus us who have not, even those of us who might live middle class, still, we don't really have that much extra like they do in case of shit like this happening and whatnot. We're reliant on focusing on ourselves in order to live. That's the truth. That is how life works. And I'm sure you guys understand that notion, because a lot of you likely have to figure out what can I skip in this and what can I skip in this in order to make this and this and this happen to line up so I'm not fucking myself with my time and my money. I'm there with you. How am I, who works 80 hours a week, all my worries, barely has any money, what am I supposed to do for somebody halfway across the world who's being tortured and abused too? They have it so much worse than us, but I can't do anything about it because I don't have the time, I don't have the money, I don't have the brain bandwidth, the brain matter, the ability to think anymore after all of the shit that I have to do regularly to worry about somebody else like that. And when I do, it breaks my heart. And so what do I do instead? Well, I distract myself with what types of things? Things that we consume, of course. That's the cycle of consumerism. They hit us with that stuff we're knowledgeable about, and we know we can't do anything about it. We buy more stuff, which means we need to make more money, which means I have less time to do things for that person. Cycle. Do we feel guilty for our lack of action? Some of us do, some of us don't. Either way, but it is there. Do we feel guilty about that child? Do you feel guilty about the fact that probably some of the clothes that you're wearing, some of the products that you're using were built by children who were tortured and enslaved? Do you feel guilty about it? I do. Got this from Target. Bet you a child made it. And I feel like shit, and I wear it all the time, and I'm trying to wear it until it fucking breaks down because I know the pain that was put into it. As we think about that, also think, do the needs of the whole or the majority outweigh the needs of the few or the child? Most of us say that the needs of the majority rule. That is why we at least think that we have a democracy. We don't. We have a republic or an oligarchy if you want to really get into it, but we won't here. We typically think that what's going to hurt the least amount of people is the appropriate response. It makes sense logically. Emotionally, though, does it make sense? Because what if you're one of the few? You feel very personally attacked when your needs are not met, when you are pushed aside because other people need instead. Most of us want to do something for the child. And if we were the child, we would hope somebody would do it for us because we couldn't. That is what she's really trying to tell us, is that we need to worry less about ourselves and what we think makes us happy and actually worry about each other. It's funny how it's still about the whole of us, but all of us individual at the same time. It's a very strange dichotomy. What does Drews represent? Weed, LSD, acid, opioids, opium, things that make us feel better, things that we get addicted to, drugs, right? Like things that make us languor and relaxed. Let's look at how she actually described it. For those who like it, the fate-insistent sweetness of Drews may perfume the ways of the city. Drews, which first brings a great lightness and brilliance to the mind and limbs, and then after some hours of dreamy languor, and wonderful visions of the very arcana and innermost secrets of the universe, as well as exciting the pleasure of sex beyond all belief. And it is not habit-forming. Okay, opium and opioids are habit-forming. Weed can be habit-forming. LSD, not typically habit-forming. Why is she using those as the metaphor there? Well, that's because what do plenty of people do when the outside world is too much to handle? Well, they disappear into something that might be drugs. We self-medicate, we drink, we smoke cigarettes, we smoke pot, we take acid. I mean, there's plenty of real life problems you can start citing here with the things that this is referencing. But we also disappear into our phones, disappear into a book. These are not habit forming, but still things that we do so that we can ignore the world. And that is one of the reasons why she put the books, she put religion, she put sex as different variations of the reasons or ways we disappear from the terrible realities of life and the world that we live in. Let's also talk about this idea of luxury and the lizard brain. And remember from the documentary about the ads and marketing, they're talking about the lizard brain and how the lizard wants something and it's going to get what it wants because it's the most inner natural part of us. And most of the time it wants luxury. It wants things to be easier. It doesn't want to have to work so hard for survival. This is why we work so hard to get more money, to get a better paying job, and get an education and all these things because we want the luxury. Think about the people of Omelas. Do they have outrageous technology? No. What do they have? Air conditioning, washing machines, things that make life easier. These are luxury items. They are the car that we drive to work and school. They are the shower that cleans us so that we have running water and aren't nasty smelling things, or the washing machine so that we don't have to physically spend an hour scrubbing our own clothes and hanging them out to dry. I could probably list a great deal more things. You guys probably have a great deal of those things in mind. Write them down. They're good. But that's why she references those things that are not necessary, but not destructive. It's luxury stuff, things that make us feel better, and the reason why we continue to buy things made by people who have it worse than us. There's the ploy of our easy first world life. Also notice how the representation of technology is separate from nature. They're very natural people, very in tune with nature, at least that's what we're made to believe. And the reason for that is to create that utopia. Remember when we were talking about dystopian characteristics, and one of them is the sphere of nature? Well, these guys don't have it. And it is to showcase the utopia aspects. She is trying really, really, really hard to make us believe that this is a utopia when it is not. For example, why reference fairy tales on page 349? So at the bottom of the page. Omelas sounds in my words like a city in a fairy tale, long ago and far away, once upon a time. Because it sounds too good to be true. Fairy tales are made of magic and happy endings, and that's not always what the world is like, right? It's not reality. And that's why every time she tells us about all of this stuff that seems too good to be true, she's saying, well, this seems like a fairy tale. It's a reference to make us clearly form that idea that there's no way this can be real, besides the fact that she keeps asking us, do you believe me now? Well, what about this? Do you believe me now? Oh, please add something if your own fancy bits to make you believe that this place that is not real is true. This unbelievable place, this utopia that we all hope for, which is unattainable. We want you to believe that it's true. She's trying her hardest to make us believe in a fairy tale. References of that fairy tale also come from the Garden of Eden. This perfect place where these two people lived in complete peace and happiness, no worries about their bodies or where they were going to get food from. They were completely happy in the Garden of Eden until sin was brought, the snake, the child, the truth of what the world means. That is what that metaphor it means, and it's very present here because it also, at the end, references the parable of Jesus. Question: where do the ones who walk away go? The people at the end. She very clearly and vividly describes how they leave. They leave alone. Alone. They walk out into the darkness. And they're alone. And they walk. And I mean, she repeats this so many times at the end. And then she tells us the place they go is so much more unbelievable than this utopia. Well, what's the next step up from the Garden of Eden? Heaven, right? Some people don't believe in heaven. It's unbelievable to think of this complete, pure utopian happiness because we believe in the real world that it's not obtainable. And that is why I believe that there's a connection of where are they actually going? Well, they're killing themselves. And can you go to heaven if you kill yourself? No, but it's a sacrifice, like Jesus is, to absolve of the sin. They want to be absolved of the sin of that child and their participation in that child's misery. So it could be that they kill themselves. It could be that they go over to the third world and do their best to actually fight, or go to DC and try to be part of the politics that are going to change the policies to make sure those people get a better life. I mean, there are different options. I'm pretty dark. I believe they kill themselves because they have to go alone into the darkness of an unbelievable place. You are free, by the way, to have your own interpretation of this. I am perfectly okay with that. I am just showing you guys what I see. You can see more than I see. That's fine. I'm alright with it. Alright, so how does she use vividness to set up her utopia? Not only is she asking us over and over and over again, but vividness, remember, is one of those satirical elements. She is drastically trying to create imagery that sits with us, like the crumbs in the beard, the flowers in the shining hair, the ribbons in the horse's mane, the fluttering flags, the beautiful mountains. All of these things create a very vivid picture for us of this utopia. It does sound like a fairy tale. It's described like a movie we would see, Cinderella. I mean, this is the reason for vividness. And this also, on the other side of the coin, other side of the sword, the dichotomy, they were talking about, good and evil, pleasure and pain, first world versus the third world, that child versus Omelas. We very vividly see that child in its misery. We hear it calling out for its mom. We see it sitting in its own poop. We see it sores and it festers. We see how malnourished it is because of its bones and its lack of muscle, and how it looks 6 instead of 10. I mean, these are very vivid descriptions in order to make us react, to make us see that image and compare it to the first vivid image that we saw and experienced. To create that comparison. That is why she's very vivid, or why she's vivid about her descriptions of those two themes and people. Question: can one person make a difference? Most of us say no, but let me tell you something. There are plenty of those one individuals that made a difference. Now, usually that one individual also had a group of people behind them, but they had to start somewhere. They had to start with an idea. You might be thinking Martin Luther King Jr., Abraham Lincoln. There are plenty of people we can think of that, or that one person that made a difference that we think of as icons, right? We normally feel like us as that one person can't make a difference, and I'm going to tell you you're wrong, because you do have the power to change your behavior. And your behavior, in a snowball effect, might change other people's behavior, because especially if we start thinking if we do actually make a difference, and that idea permeates the collective consciousness of our world to think, if I do something, then someone else is thinking I can do something, and someone else is thinking I can do something, and all of a sudden you have 20 something, then you have 100 some one persons, and you have thousands of one persons, and it snowballs, right? All having that thought of I can make a difference, and then eventually we're a crowd and we do. And that is to vote with your dollar. That is the only way I can think of that you can actually guarantee you are making a difference, is to vote with your dollar. And what that means is to pay attention to where you give your money, where you spend money on products, on services, etc. Some things are unavoidable. You might be leasing from somebody who does shady shit, but you don't really have any other choice because that's your price range. Like, yeah, we can't really do much about that right now. But can you shop at a local grocery store instead of at Walmart? Yeah. Granted, they have the same products, but as the start in doing things locally, you want to make a change, you do things in your community, and hopefully that snowballs into a larger community, city, county, state, country, continent, world difference when it starts to permeate. And there's a great ad for this, by the way, from an insurance company of doing small things for people every day, and I'm actually making a difference, because guess what? Being kind is another way of making a difference one at a time. But the point is that one person can make a difference even though we're made to believe that it's not. So let's vote with that dollar. That's part of saving that person, that child that we feel guilty about. Why is it important that they're intelligent? We repeated quite a few times that they're scientists, that they're intelligent people, that they lack guilt and all these other things. Well, it's because they are aware of what is actually happening in the world. It's to reference us. We're all intelligent people here. That makes us aware of the atrocities of the world. That makes us aware of what companies, or at least have the ability to know what companies are bad companies and do terrible things. I just gave you a list not that long ago of some of those people, or some of those corporations, and it still happens. They still let it happen, and that's the important part. It's supposed to make us feel that guilt, that satire is supposed to make us feel foolish and hate this behavior because we're intelligent people. That's why the people of Omelas are intelligent. How does she create foreshadowing? Well, much like I said before with her creation of the utopia, she keeps asking us if we believe. She keeps creating these overly good, heavenly-like scenarios and images and telling us that pain and pleasure, you can take pleasure and pain's the banal and all these other things, setting us up for this idea that there's going to be something terrible that's got to make us believe that this is true, because we know utopias can't exist, right? So one of those moments is all smiles have become archaic, indicating how there's an actual lack of happiness. But to praise despair is to condemn delight. To embrace violence is to lose hold of everything else. We have almost lost hold, and we can no longer describe a happy man or make any celebration of joy. How can I describe the people of Omelas? They are not naive and happy children, though their children were in fact happy. Like, she's setting us up for failure, for the lack of true utopic ability in society. And then of course we get the change on 352 in a basement under one of the beautiful public buildings, and still trying to describe all of this niceness until we get to this child sitting in his own poop. Why give the child memories? Well, for an emotional connection. If we know that it remembers its mother's voice and the feeling of sunlight, and we know that it begged to be let out and that it would be good, we feel a more emotional connection to the message that she's creating of the dire circumstances that these children are actually in. It creates that pleasure pain. We can't know true pleasure without understanding what pain is, because if it grew up like that, it wouldn't know any better. It wouldn't have that pleasure to remember to compare to the abominable misery that she says he has. Is the child a scapegoat? Absolutely. It is blamed for its own place in the world and kept there because of it. And they use this rationalization in order to keep the child there. So they essentially blame the victim. It's a defense mechanism, and that's on page 355. We see them saying things when they come into terms with the absolute rules of having that child in the basement and the rules of their society. So they say, but as time goes on, they begin to realize that even if the child could be released, it would not get much good of its freedom. A little vague pleasure of warmth and food, no doubt, but little more. It is too degraded and imbecile to know any real joy. It has been afraid too long ever to be free of fear. Its habits are too uncouth for it to respond to humane treatment. Indeed, after so long, it would probably be wretched without walls about it to protect it, and darkness for its eyes, and its own excrement to sit in. It is saying that the child would not be happy without all of this fear and darkness and loneliness and sitting in its own waste. And this is that defense mechanism. It's making themselves believe that they're not so bad, because it probably wouldn't do any better anyways. And we have proof that people who have lived through terrible circumstances can indeed have happy lives and recover. They say this about sex slaves all the time, how they won't get any good out of their lives after they've been free. They've been through so much trauma, and that's not true. People have recovered from that. Is it tough? Do they have to do the work for it? Yeah, absolutely, but it is possible, and it shouldn't deter anybody from trying to rescue those people or stop those things from happening. And that's, once again, her point in making these people who are intelligent have this rational train of thought, because we all do in some way in order to be able to live our lives a little bit easier. So knowing suffering as described by Le Guin, can the citizens of Omelas really be happy? Probably not. That's why they have all these festivals and this music and this good food and the sex and beer and drugs and you name it, all of these luxury items, because they're not happy. And you shop when you're not happy, and you want new things and gadgets and to do these experiences when you're not happy. Now granted, some of the times they're probably happy, but they keep saying that guilt's not there. But it is, because they have to hide under all of these things in order to not feel that guilt. Because could you be happy knowing somebody was or is tortured for your luxury? We've talked about this already. You're probably not. I'm not, knowing those things. So there's no way that they could be happy about it. So my last question, final question. What options are open for those who stay to change their belief system and change their morality at the same time? Not a lot of options. You are either, as they say, the terms are absolute. This is either going to happen, you're going to have to deal with that child being there, as most of them are, or you're going to leave. because you're not going to be the one to take that child out of the closet. There's too many people to fight you about it because they want their luxury, they want their happiness. So your option is to stay and conform, maybe take some drugs, self-medicate, or leave. Go do something somewhere else to help somebody or kill yourself, as I said before, is my belief of her ending of the story. Self-sacrifice so that you're no longer a part of the sin of harboring that child. There's the ones who walk away from Omelas. Let me know if you have any questions. Comments below, email me, whatnot. I'll be available to talk about these things, but there's one of the options for your paper. Alright guys, see you next time. By the way guys, I have a blog post about vivid language and satire on my blog. I'll give you the link because you can totally use that as one of your sources. For the essay, you probably should have more than just the 3 I'm requiring anyways, including that one, because plenty of sources on slave labor, on the gap between the rich and the poor, or any really discriminated against group. We're talking about those, again, those who have and those who have not. But you can use, essentially I'm just talking about, you can use my blog post as one of your sources, and I'll link it for you guys to read about vivid description. It's not going to give you a terrible amount about the analysis, but it should give you something if you're struggling for word count. So, alright.